Okay.
Oof. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the BannedBooks podcast, episode number 182.
Sounds nice, but I don't think it's accurate.
Okay. Is anything on the show accurate, though?
Let's see. We've done 181, 182. Oh, we didn't actually broadcast that yet, though. So we're recording 2 episodes. Yeah. Okay. So we'll let Chester come out as one. So let's call it 182. We'll call it 182.
Somewhere.
There you go.
Okay. We'll call it that. We'll see how it floats.
All right.
As always, we are your marsupial hosts, Christopher Gillespie.
Marsupial. Mammals. Anyway.
It was a word. It was in my head.
Okay. Chillin' and willin', maxin' and relaxin'.
I'm Donovan Riley.
Well, kind of chilling, willin', maxin' and relaxin'. My blood pressure's low right now. How's yours?
It's pretty good, actually. I helped my elder clean out the basement under the stairs of the church. I love throwing stuff out.
Oh, yeah. That's
church.
A stress reliever if there ever was
general.
one.
It really is. Yeah. Now we're putting in a new water softener and heater. So we have to actually find the water softener in the heater so we can replace it. It was kind of buried under stuff. So if you're a Lutheran, you understand what I'm talking about. We never throw away anything in the Lutheran church because you might need it in the future.
I don't know if it's just Lutheran.
This morning that we had a dozen fans.
I think it's German Lutheran in particular. Just that stingy, post
frugal.
Yeah,
not stingy,
frugal. But also, I mean, we're still living in the shadow of the Depression. It's the Great Depression,
right?
I think so. Anyway,
we can call it that. I think it's just, hey, that stuff's down there. It's garbage, but I don't want to throw it out because it might be important to somebody else.
That's called good stewardship, right?
Right, there you go.
Never throwing anything away.
Today, we are going to read a holy troublemaker, one of our spiritual fathers in the faith, Herman Sasse. And this is from, is this an essay officially?
I don't know. I don't know what the context was. Yeah. Oh, it says it's an essay in the introduction. So
we'll call it an essay from 1930 on the two kingdoms, essentially. Distinction, not division, but distinction between the church and the state. And the relationship of the two to each other. Because as we've been discussing with Chesterton, and who else did we read on this?
Who else did we read? We actually did.
It goes back to even the definition of justice that when we went through.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we've been dealing with intersection of church and state in various ways, COVID-y, for some time. We did the Whitford, the church and state have existed in an often unhealthy tension.
That's right. Yeah.
Clement of Alexandria, not so much. I mean, that was martyrdom, but it does connect. Christ in the Psalms, no, not so much. So yeah, learning in wartime with C.S. Lewis.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, we got into it there. But we did. This is the first time we've dealt with Sasse. We had Sasse on against National Socialism.
That's right.
Episode 104.
Well, depending on who wins the election, we might be bringing that essay back.
And that came from 1932. So, the Nazis were kind of getting to be more popular then.
Sorry, National Socialist Party.
Oh, sorry. Did I say Nazi?
Everybody knows what Nazi stands for. I mean,
do they? Okay.
No, they don't. It's like Jesus Christ. It's not his last name.
Right. Well, you had National Socialists, and then you had, anti-fascist communists.
Yes.
What an odd binary polarity going on in Germany.
Right.
It's like, and there had to have been some people that were like, can we just kind of come together somewhere in the
Can we smooth out the definition so I can actually figure out who's who?
You want to burn everything down. You want to take everybody's stuff. Can we?
Right.
Can we kind of compromise somewhere?
That is an irony, isn't it? We're going to burn. We thought you were working with us, not against us.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Pick a side.
Oh, well.
But Sasse, as we discussed in the previous episode, is prescient. He is a true student of history. And I think you and I both learned from him how to learn from history.
Right.
That being said, like with my background in church history and studying historiography and historiographers who teach you how to learn and teach history and write about history, those who actually learn from history are technically the ones who are doomed because no one listens to them.
I was going to say there, I mean, you're going to be an outsider.
Mm-hmm.
If you dare to add context to what's going on, think about like, well, I mean, this would be really simple right now. Let's say, well, you're not allowed to contest an election because don't you see that somebody has already been declared the winner by the media? And like, wait a minute now, just about 2 months ago, you who say we should just concede and allow, just accept the loss, we're saying that we're not going to concede and they're not going to accept any loss.
Correct.
So, I mean, that's just like 2 months of history. It's not, you don't have to go back very far.
Sure.
And say, you're not even holding yourself to the same standard that you presented, just a couple months ago.
Well, and the fact of the matter is, in any coup d'etat, like we're going through a coup d'etat right now,
I think so.
In 1930, he's basically, they're on the edge of a coup d'etat. And the media in Germany, same thing, because Goebbels immediately seized control of the media.
That's right.
On behalf of the Socialist Democratic Party.
They were making the movies too, right?
Making the movies, exactly. That came a little bit after later. That, but he sees what's happening. That's the thing, is that this is 1930. He sees what's coming.
Well, for a political
what
coup,
they're doing,
you really have to take captive all the all the cultural means that are used to form opinion.
Correct.
So that you can manipulate the public opinion,
right,
to support you.
By the way, guess where this took off at? I was having a conversation with my trustee, or no, my tattooist on Saturday. I was having this conversation because he was asking me, why are they shutting down the bars and restaurants? And I said, well, historically, do you know where all revolutions start?
Yeah,
bars and coffee shops.
Right. Yeah.
So why? Because that's where people gather and talk. And you definitely don't want people talking after 10 p.m. in a bar because they've had a little bit of alcohol, their tongues are a little loose, they're wagging, they start talking, they start plotting, they start getting their stories, and they're like, hey, you know what? I'm disgruntled too. Or, hey, I'm for this too. Right. We should get together. They did it. This is actually how the socialists organized.
Right. And it doesn't happen to the same effect with digital media.
No.
I mean, even the things that we call social media, which are really antisocial, but I ironically call them social media. I think they drive us apart more than they actually bring us together.
Well, that's Orwellian doublespeak too, though. Is that?
Yeah, it is.
It's not even a matter of certain language or certain ecosystems socially are filled with doublespeak. It's that our entire culture now is simply doublespeak.
Yeah. Well, it's like social distancing. It's like, no, you don't want to socially distance. You might want to physically distance oneself, but it's not social. Right. And what was the other one I heard the other? Well, I mean, even quarantine. Somebody said, well, I needed to go into quarantine. I'm like, were you sick?
Right.
Like, no. Well, then you weren't quarantining.
Right. Lockdown.
Well, I don't know what to call it.
Lockdown is actually a prison term.
Yeah.
That's where it comes from.
Call it what it is. It's you're being locked down. You're being isolated.
It's a prison cell. You just call it your house.
Right.
Ask people in Australia, New Zealand, Britain, Ireland, and Canada.
Well, no, but we talked about this before we went on air. You can't ask them. You're not going to hear about them.
Right, exactly. They're not allowed to speak.
Have you seen any? I mean, I've been scouring. I cannot find stories about what's happening with COVID in third world.
Right.
It's not being reported. What's happening? Like you can see my
background.
Spoiler,
people are dying.
You can see my background. I mean, most coffee is grown in third world.
Correct.
And I want to be able to continue to sell people coffee. Right now, the coffee I'm getting was shipped, 3 to 6 months ago.
Right.
So, and it was on containers but I mean, how is the coffee crop going to look? Because of labor or even reduced workforce. I mean, we did see, I think at the beginning, some stories of, was it Peru, where they were just piling the bodies in the street?
Yeah. Not, to be clear, not from COVID. They're not dying from COVID. They're dying from starvation.
Yeah.
They're dying from not being treated for
you can't report
illnesses and other diseases.
You can't.
They're starving to death.
Yeah, you lock them in your home and you reduce the whole supply chain.
Right.
In a country that's already close to poverty or are in poverty. Many of them in poverty. Yeah, and we're not seeing it from Africa either. I haven't heard anything. And now that's not exactly true. I have taken the time to try to find.
Well, I was going to say you have to go out of your way to go find.
But you have to go out of your way, and it's like. And this is the thing, being in a first world where the third world's dependent upon you, right?
Right.
especially agriculturally and other,
Mhm.
well, I mean, even like making your clothing, right?
Right.
Like Indonesia or somewhere like that. What's the impact of ours saying, well, you know what, we're going to reduce, we're not going to go to our work, we're just going to live off of some government, surplus or offerings or whatever you want to call them.
Sure.
And we're not going to buy their stuff for 8
Right.
months or 10 months. And meanwhile, we don't ask, what's the consequence for you?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, this goes to the point. This is Saz's point. This is the point of anyone who's a student of history who learns from history, is the dehumanization that comes from what's called social distancing and sheltering at home. The dehumanization that comes from losing your ability to actually go to the corner market and get food for yourself for the day.
Right.
Which is the way that a lot of people in third world countries survive day to day, is they have to go down to the market and get their food.
Right.
Because they don't have refrigeration, for example.
Well, and I think, the topic really is of the thing we're going to look at is politics. And you're like, a lot of people approach politics as being some kind of, well, I don't know, like a game, like a sporting event that really doesn't have much of a consequence. And like, actually, no, it has very significant consequences, and it always has.
Right.
You deceive yourself if you can. We've talked about this in regards to the rise of Nazi socialism, right? And like, you can stand back and act as if it's never going to affect you.
Right.
But eventually you won't be able to say that didn't have an effect, because now they're at your doorstep, and it's crystal knock in your town.
Which, by the way, the Jews were expressed in Hitler's speeches, for example, and in the propaganda. The Jews were a contagion, because Hitler was a germaphobe, and he saw everything in terms of bacterial infections, contagions, and that's how he spoke of the Jews, of homosexuals, of black people, of gypsies, is they're a contagion.
Well, that's why I talked about, you're not quarantined unless you're sick, right? Because if you're quarantined because you're sick, I mean, that makes sense. You're trying to isolate the virus from other people, right? And you happen to be carrying that virus. So then, but if you're not sick and you're being isolated, now you're being treated as the virus.
Right. Which is how we tend to treat third world countries, actually.
Yeah.
Popularly speaking.
As expendable, or just...
Yeah, we use them.
To be corralled and to be used. That's terrible.
Like, we don't care that child labor makes our shoes or our t-shirts or our Gucci bags or our...
Well, we do care. It's just, as long as you don't tell us, then we don't have to care.
Right. We don't care about the Uyghur Muslims and the genocide that's being carried out against them. We don't care.
No, and we'll let China lecture us about human rights violations.
Right. That's a good one.
Like, are you serious?
Right.
If you're following along at home, just go to the UN Twitter feed and you can read it.
And so we just care in an abstract way. But when I'm told, well, you can pay $500 for this phone or $2,000 for this phone, which would you prefer? Well, if it means that I don't have to live with the fact that I'm contributing to genocide, I'll go for the $2,000 phone.
Yeah.
I don't need a new phone every year. I don't need new shoes every year. I don't need a Gucci bag. I don't need these things. But,
well, and I think some people have been able to demonstrate. I mean, I'm thinking like Tesla Motors. Sure. If you can innovate and produce domestically, people are willing to pay a premium for it.
Yeah. Jocko does the same thing with his products, right? Maine.
Oh yeah, with the jeans, wasn't it?
The jeans, the boots, everything. The Malk, it's all made in America.
Yeah. And you pay a premium
more for it, but you're paying to employ people in Maine, for example.
Your neighbors,
who are skilled laborers.
Yeah, your countrymen.
Exactly. So this is all coming to the head now of, this is what Sasse is addressing, is everything that we've talked about in the present tense, he actually was addressing in 1930.
Well, and I made the argument, I think a couple episodes ago, that, the project that we're experiencing now has been tried in various ways. And it's really the same project that he was experiencing, of this globalist, I mean, obviously Hitler tried to do it through force, right? Through conquering and...
Right. Well, it's kind of hard to get a lot of people on board with your plan. And time is limited and you're a finite human being. So do you spend 60, 70, 100 years convincing people that your plan works, or do you invade Poland?
Right. So he got a little bit antsy on the plan. But I think we've seen the fruition of it now. The same ideology is at work. And maybe this is the time we can finally pull it off, right? And I'm not saying we, you and I.
Right. But
talking
it's
about
the
these-
same, it's the idealism of, hey, we can do it right this time.
Yeah, the guys in the ivory tower that have the
Mhm.
grand plan for humanity.
Right.
They think that they can reset everything
Mhm.
and do it better this time.
Yep. Build it back better.
Hmm.
Every
Thank
time.
you. Thank you.
Build it back better.
Let's not talk about that.
So let's dive into
Enough
let's dive
prelude.
into Herman Sasse from his essay, The Social Doctrine of the Augsburg Confession. And we will do our best
Yep.
with our limited mental capacity to walk you through what he's referring to when it comes to Lutheran confessions, if you're not familiar with them.
That's swimming in the deep end. Even for us.
It's inside baseball. And we acknowledge that.
Well,
Sasse is a genius level intellect.
Yeah, I think
in my
so.
opinion.
Yeah. That's the hard part.
Yeah, he can see patterns. I'm a pattern recognition type of person. And I'm like, hey, I see patterns. And Sasse's like, no.
But you're like, you got the chart on the wall and you're,
right.
Like,
I've got the 60-inch TV, and he's like, dude, I'm IMAX. I'm seeing this in IMAX. Like, you don't even understand.
Right. And in 3D.
Yes. So the governing authority and the orders established with it are according to the Articles 16 and 28 of the Augsburg Confession.
Mm-hmm.
The Augsburg Confession. And the civil orders. Wait, did I just jump? I'm going to reset. The governing authority and the orders established with it, for example, your station in life and other people's station in life, are according to Articles 16 and 28, good works and gifts from God. They are willed by God and given to his creation. So the governing authority is a good work and a gift from God.
Right.
Your vocation, your station in life, whether you be a plumber or a teacher or a postal worker or a flight attendant or whatever you are, even pastors.
Well, or citizen.
Or citizen even, yes.
Yeah, or parents.
Is a good work and a gift from God. And they are willed by God and given to his creation for the sake of love. Not salvation, love. The task of the governing authority is described as the protection of men against injustice and power, and the maintenance of justice and peace. This is the task of the civil governing authorities.
Law and order?
Law and order.
Really?
And specifically, and this is key, I think, too, because I addressed this, I think we both addressed this in our sermon yesterday, justice and peace according to God's word, not according to philosophers.
Right. Yeah.
And this is key.
It is.
Because like we pointed out in in the episodes on justice, postmodernity defines justice as power.
Right.
He says injustice and power and the maintenance of justice and peace. When we mean power, we mean straight line, right-handed force. The threat of
really
violence.
left-handed. Well, right-handed power, I suppose. But right-handed would be done in
sense.
Yeah. Oh, in an earthly sense.
Robert Capon talks about that, right? Left-handed passive, right hand is active.
Well, a good expression of this would be, the woman's right to control her body, which is a statement of power, right? And you're like, okay, you do have authority over your body. You don't have authority over the life that's in your body.
Inside your body?
Yeah, exactly. If you want to put it that way. But now we come to that conclusion. I mean, you can from natural law, I think, from observation, heartbeats, that kind of thing, right? I mean, at least, by 20 weeks or something, you'd be like, this is not zygote or whatever. I don't know, fetus or whatever. This is human life. And we would argue from conception, but we get that from God's own word, right? Which defines and says, no, life that's created in the womb is human life.
I wove you together in the secrets of your mother, in the secret of your mother's womb, and I've known you. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That's justice, though. Justice is defending the widow and the orphan, regardless of who the widow and orphan are. Peace is God's peace. And then how that translates into earthly peace comes from God's word. Comes from God's will.
We've talked about power. I think I've made the distinction that I got from John Kleinig here on the show, but it's worth remembering is that power is only exercised appropriately when it's done under authority.
Correct.
So whether it's the authority of the civil estate or of parents for children or a pastor over his congregation, I mean, that authority has been delegated to them from God. That's ultimately our perspective. It all comes from above. And without that authority, then if you exercise power where you've not been given the authority,
correct.
Now it's actually disorderly, chaotic, demonic even. Disorder, it's bringing.
And you see this practically speaking when someone, let's say someone comes into my house and begins to behave as if they are the father of my children.
Tell your kids how to behave or something.
Right. My children, they're going to discipline my kids, for example, for misbehaving.
Oh, yeah.
One, my kids are going to look at them like, what? What are you doing? Like,
Yeah.
who are you? And they're probably going to listen if this person is forceful and they feel like they're being threatened by this larger person. But then I, as a father, when I come into my house and see someone else behaving in such a way, if I haven't given them permission to discipline my children, I'm going to react negatively toward them behaving.
Yeah, they may not ever be able to come back in your house.
More than likely.
Because that's actually, I mean, even if it was done with good intent, it's actually
Correct.
abuse.
Yes.
Because they didn't have the authority to do it.
Right. Yeah, they took what was not given.
Correct.
So thus the power of the sword is given to the governing authority. Quote, the governing authority protects the body and external possessions against open injustice and rules men with the sword and with corporal punishment in order to guard civil righteousness and peace.
That's
To
Article
guard
28, by the way.
Righteousness and peace. To guard. Not to enforce, to guard. The enforcement, like we talked about with Augustine and just war.
Yeah.
When is it moral to go to war? When you are going in response to someone bringing conflict to your front door.
Yeah, when you have to.
When you have to. Likewise, then the governing authorities protect the body and external possessions, not internal, not your conscience, not your soul, external possessions, against open injustice, second table of the commandments, and rules men with a sword and with corporal punishment in order to guard, protect civil righteousness and peace.
I mean, Christians aren't inherent. I mean, maybe it's hard to even say the term, because if I said pacifist, it's a loaded term, right? It has semantic. It has a semantic domain that isn't really. Yeah, that. What I look at, I say, look, I'm against unjust war. I'm against unnecessary wars, foreign conflicts where we just don't have any business there. They're like, well, wait a minute, but they're your neighbors. Are they? They're halfway around the world. And I think we can look at history again. This is where, we'll get excluded, because we'll look at history and say, all right, now what was the benefit of those conflicts? Who did it benefit? Did it actually, I mean, we went into Syria, left a vacuum, and then we got ISIS. That went really well. What did we actually gain from that? Did we want ISIS? Did we actually, that's a question.
Well, somebody might have gained something from that, but you and I don't know about it.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing with the Iraq wars, right?
Yeah.
There was certainly some benefit there.
For some people, yes.
For some people, right? I mean, Halliburton was a big one, right?
Petrodollar. Destabilization, yeah.
Yeah.
But does it benefit the people of the region? Well, I have friends, right? I have people who follow the Warrior Priest podcast who are former military who will say, our being there was good for the local people. They wanted us to stay.
For the minority, especially.
Because there is no law and order. You don't get to call 911 if there's a problem. It's whoever has the biggest stick that they make the rules.
Right.
And so having someone there who had a bigger stick was positive because they were engaged in commerce. They were able to send their kids to school without the threat of being attacked and so forth. And so my point is, this is never binary.
No.
It's messy because we're sinners and we live in a broken and a sinful world. And what, as one person said, what those politicians, how the politicians benefited from us being in Afghanistan, I don't comprehend that. All I know is that where I was stationed and what I was doing was benefiting them because we built a school and a hospital and we protected them from the Taliban.
Well, and ultimately, the bigger machinations of politics, of government, of war, I mean, you really aren't in control.
Right.
I mean, there's only one guy at the top, ultimately, or a team. All you can do is your part down, at the level where you work, make the most of a bad situation, ultimately. Right.
Now, to bring it even closer to home, because I live in Minnesota.
Yeah.
What if you not only vilify law enforcement, but get rid of law enforcement? Now what?
Murder rates pretty
spike
up.
It turns out when people realize there's no law enforcement, they do crime.
Well, and this is the conversation I was having this morning, kind of conversation, whatever you call it on social media, interaction, I guess is probably the best thing, is to say, well, are people going to commit voter fraud? Well, I was listening to podcasts all weekend of people talking about all the fraud they committed.
Correct.
They're like, oh, well, I got one ballot from my previous address. I got one here. My parents got one that was under my maiden name. They got the one from when I was living there.
Right.
And so, I mean, this person openly said, I sent in 4 ballots. You're like, that's not legitimate.
There are thousands of lawsuits right now that are being filed by citizens against their state
Right.
in their states for
Right.
voter fraud, that they witnessed voter fraud, that they were asked to be culpable in voter fraud.
Or thousands of people participating in lawsuits. I don't know if there's 1,000 lawsuits, but there's a lot.
No, they're filing lawsuits.
Mhm.
That's kind of the side effects. Like this is
Well, we have civilian ones here. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The point is then,
Given the
governing
opportunity,
authority
yeah,
to carry the sword to protect and guard society from those who would behave unjustly and disturb the peace,
hmm
to take away, for example, law enforcement, to
Right,
vilify them
right.
as a whole, is actually working against God.
Or to not enforce the laws that you've
And
set
by
up.
the way, guess what the National Socialist Party in Germany did when they came into power? They got rid of the police. Why did they do that?
Put in their own police.
Because they put in their own police force. Yeah.
hmm Yeah.
So I think, and the reason that I think you and I, we talked about this off air, the reason that we want to have this conversation is because even as Lutherans, we just don't spend enough time on the two kingdoms doctrine.
Nope.
Because like you said, even, and I think for you and I, we would agree, it's difficult for us to vote sometimes. Because
Well, I just haven't.
Yeah, I don't want to say that out loud, but yeah, no, I've been
Okay.
voted for a while. The point being though, is that we look at both parties, we both look at both platforms, we look at both campaigns and their agenda, and we say, no.
And third parties too, by the way.
And third parties, and say, no, I don't think so. Really, this is the best? Is this what God's giving us as far as our options for earthly authority?
Well, I mean, as was brought up in my Bible study, it's like, remember when when Israel asked for a king? And God's like, no, you really don't want one.
Right.
And like, no, we really do.
How'd that work out for you?
We really want one. Okay. Well, the best you're going to get, I think, arguably, is David.
Mhm.
And even David's kind of a mixed bag. So,
Right.
yeah, I mean, are you going to no? Because you're putting a fallible, human, sinful human person,
Right.
in a leadership role.
Right.
It's going to be messy and mixed up.
Right.
That's why I'm not convinced by the whole argument that we want our leaders to be noble and virtuous in like their character. It's like, no, ultimately, I just want them to do the right thing. I don't even
Right.
care if they do it for the right reasons, honestly.
Well, even after Abimelech, they got the king they deserved. They got the king they actually asked for when they demanded that Gideon be their king. And he's like, no, not me, not my sons, not my great, no.
Right.
They got Abimelech. He's like, I'll be your king. And they're like, awesome. What are you going to do?
I mean, his name even means king, so that's pretty awesome too.
And then even after what he does, and then God replaces him with a judge, the people still lament the fact that they don't have the king. It's like, dude, he was a bloodthirsty monster.
Well, it's like Israel in the wilderness saying, hey, it was great under Pharaoh.
Right. Yeah, it wasn't that bad.
What?
I mean, at least we were eating.
What were you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's that. What's that? His chronological snobbery is what Lewis calls it, or it's really just like historical naivete, maybe.
Willful ignorance, maybe.
Yeah, willful ignorance. That's even better. Yeah,
it's always the myth of progress, that we're always better, that we're always improving, that we're always evolving, and that's not just since Darwin. Everybody believes that, going back to, Cain and Abel. It's like, I like Abel's offering, but I'm the savior. That's what my name basically means, man.
Yeah.
So the problem then is always what we want. And then God, we go up to that door, we knock on that door, and we say, hey, God, open the door and let us know, what's your will for our lives. The problem is that door is a mirror. And we always walk up to the door, we see ourselves, and we think to ourselves, hey, look, God opened the door, and it's me. I see myself. So whatever I want, that must mean that's what God wants.
So not even just individually, but corporately, as like a country, we're selfish.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Terribly selfish.
Yeah.
Of course we are. It's human nature. So the governing authority protects the body and external possessions against open injustice, and rules men with the sword and with corporal punishment in order to guard civil righteousness and peace. It has claim to respect and obedience. The requirement to be obedient to its commands and laws ceases when it commands something which can only be done with sin. Then the apostolic word applies: one must obey God rather than men. I made this point in my sermon yesterday, distinguishing between the two commands: obey the civil authorities because they bear the sword, versus love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
What does he mean that you can only do this if you sin? If you act contrary to love your neighbor as yourself, or love your neighbor as you need to be loved.
Or you could use the commands as kind of your framework if you want.
That's crazy.
I know.
What else you got?
Isn't that how you define love anyway?
Not me. No. I just look in the mirror and I say, mirror, mirror on the wall.
Free love, man. Free love. Do what you want. which is often unlovely, but regardless.
Right. Little bit ugly. Sorry. Homeschooling. I got kids behind me.
Tasks, projects.
Right. Craziness. So I just lost it because I had to talk to my kids.
Tell them what's what.
And it's wintertime, so the kids are wearing boots. So it makes it even more difficult to be quiet. So what do we have though is that, like, at present, we don't have, as Christians, I think, because I've been talking online
Mm-hmm.
with a lot of men, Christian men, through Warrior Priest, through BannedBooks. And this is something that comes up in relation to men and the relationship of men in the church to men in society in particular. And I just bring that up as an example that you're reflecting on what has God purposed me for as a man.
Right.
And then in relation to my church, what is my relation to my church as a man? What is my relationship to society as a man, as a citizen who believes in God and believes in God's order? When the state or my community or even my church doesn't seem to be lined up with God's will according to the commands.
Right.
Like what do we do at this point? Right? Like, let's take the fourth commandment.
Panic.
Yes, panic, fear and hysteria. No, that he's like, okay, honor your father and mother and others in authority so that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God has given you.
Command with a promise. Yeah.
Right. There's a promise attached to it. And yet I can't have a conversation about this, let's say in my community with my peers, because they don't believe in God, or they don't believe that that's God's will, or the 10 commandments have any relevance to this conversation. Or, you know what, again, like friends of mine who are in law enforcement, who are either like, I don't know if I should quit right now. I definitely don't want to encourage, like, I have a son, 10 years old. He wants to be a Navy SEAL and a cop. And I'm like, to the SEAL part, but to the law enforcement part, oh, I don't know. I don't know.
Didn't you I think I saw, was it 200,000 cops have left Minnesota?
Yeah, it's in New York City. They have a 400% rate of resignation right now.
How do you do 400%?
I don't know. I've never understood anything over 100%. I was taught in school that there's no such thing. It's like when your coach is like, I want 110%. You're like, coach, didn't you just teach me in class that there's no such thing as 110%?
Psychological. Yeah. You're supposed to give more than what you think you have.
Right. But, exactly. Yeah. I expect you to play until you die.
And then give me a little bit more.
Exactly. The David Goggins effect. But no, I think it's indicative of my kid or other people, LEOs that I interface with, that are like, yeah, I believe in God and I'm a Christian man and I want to be a good citizen. And this is how I serve my community as law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I can't do my job anymore. No. So what do I do? Is it faithful or unfaithful to get out? Because I don't want to die. It's not even, I can't do my job. I got that in my head. I walk up on this car and I don't know what to expect. The windows are tinted and their windows roll down a crack, and I don't know what to expect. And so I'm already keyed up, and and then in the back of my head is the seed of, no matter what happens, command doesn't have my back. The citizens don't have my back.
Yeah. And I was thinking about this in regards to, I made the analogy of driving. Because, I'm teaching kids to drive, and
2,000-pound bullet.
Well, yeah. And explaining to them, to my children, and, is that, you have to assume that everyone around you is an idiot.
Is texting.
Yeah, is texting or whatever. They're not paying attention. Yeah. And that you don't always pay attention. You make mistakes too. Right. So you have to assume that's defensive driving. That's what it is by definition. Correct. But there's this idea of, I'm trying to think of the ways of expression, like the common trust, that we have a common trust, and you're like, well, what do we actually have in common if we have
mutually assured destruction on the highway?
Ultimately, yeah, it seems that way sometimes. But like if you didn't trust that the people around you were going to act responsibly in your community, you wouldn't go out.
Correct.
Right. Well, so what has,
where are we at though?
Yeah, I know. So what has destroyed that public trust that we, I was listening to my favorite liberals, the Weinsteins, or Weinstein, and I forget her name, Heather, whatever her name is. Their husband and wife, kind of. I not understand their relationship at all. They're evolutionary biologists, right? So
yes,
they approach things differently.
Brett and Eric, by the way, not Harvey and his brother.
So this is Brett and his lady friend,
Eric Weinstein.
No,
is
Brett,
Weinstein,
not Eric.
or Weinstein?
It doesn't matter. Neither here nor there. We're just talking about, like, this is somebody who's a very sensible person, right? Sure. And actually liberal, votes Democrat. And like, I'm walking in the park, I'm not wearing a mask, and I get evil stares. You're
Mhm.
like, it's not transmitted in this environment.
Right. It's a virus. Look up the definition.
It's a virus. This is free air.
Mhm.
We're not going to do any kind of sustained contact. I'm going to walk past you,
Mhm.
unless I cough directly in your face or something, I
Right.
guess. But
Right.
even then, I'm not even sick. So
Right.
you've lost your mind when you.
I like what Michael Malice said, that masks are the new AIDS ribbon, because it immediately sent me back to that Seinfeld episode with Kramer.
I forgot all about that. Wow.
That's what it is. If you don't wear it, where's your mask? Which used to be, where's your AIDS ribbon? And the whole, and by the way, Fauci and Birx were involved in that too.
Uh-huh. And PCR
surprisingly.
testing was created for AIDS, by the way.
Correct.
The test we're using for COVID.
And
And it was equally
learned from
ineffective for
that.
HIV. Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Oops.
Weird. It's like we've played this game before.
Well, this is why you play the game more than once, because the next time you can tweak
Hopefully
it.
play it better. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Like my sons, they make the rules up, and every time they play, they just improve the rules to tilt the table.
Get rid of the
a little
bad
bit more.
rules, add some new rules. Yeah, okay.
The odds are always in their favor.
Speaking of Hunger Games.
But the point is then, the government claims respect and obedience from you so far as it protects and guards civil righteousness and peace.
Mm-hmm.
When it does not guard civil righteousness and peace, you then are sinning, and it is actively promoting sinning. Now, again, Sasse is referring to the National Socialist Party, i.e. Nazis, and what they were pushing for at that time.
Yeah. And at this point, it was still pretty weak. I mean, it's 1930.
Mm-hmm.
So the
was
rhetoric
a lot
hasn't,
of noise.
Yeah, the rhetoric hasn't amped up to the point of what we'd see later in like 36 or 38. But.
Yeah. I mean, by 32-ish, that's...
Well, we saw that in the thing we did in episode 104. Yeah.
Right.
32 is pretty intense by that point, I suppose.
It is, because that's when all of a sudden people from Parliament start disappearing in the middle of the night
and
are found in ditches. And the useful idiots are rounded up, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But the point is then, respect and obedience is garnered or gleaned from the citizenry through the guarding and protection of civil righteousness and peace.
Yeah.
Thus, again, the police officer in your community, and I think this is truer in smaller towns than maybe large cities where it's more, what do you want to say, dehumanized. It's easier to dehumanize other people because you're not living in the community with them.
Well, same thing as medical advice. I mean, if it's your little town doctor, you're going to likely have a much closer relationship, and you're probably going to have a higher degree of trust than you would with somebody that's downstate or something.
Right. No, 100%. The respect and obedience that I and others extend law enforcement in our community is radical. Like, you wouldn't even believe we live in the same state once you go to Minneapolis. It's a totally different framework, right? To the extent that you don't even, it's like, are we in two different dimensions here? Is this a different reality?
Well, yes.
But the law enforcement in my community live in my community.
Right.
And so the respect and obedience that they are given is contingent upon, are you protecting the public peace?
Right.
And if not, you answer to us
immediately. The other aspect of that is they have a vested interest in protecting the peace, because this is
correct.
This is their home.
Right. Exactly.
And that's who you want. I mean, it's the same thing like you elect like the town sheriff, from people that live in your community. This is somebody who's, regardless of their ethics, we know that they're going to have at least a high enough ethic that they're going to protect their own property.
So I'm going to shoot us off on a tangent. Sorry, folks.
What? I thought we were just on a tangent.
Well, now we're going to go on a further tangent. This is a spider web. Pastors have lost respect and obedience. Because you brought it up, right? Pastor as a civil vocation, as an earthly vocation. That we are not, and again, you and I both have peers will second this. I'm not making this up from my own personal situation here. I have you have a more local church than I do. I'm more of a commuter church now because we're close enough to,
that's
suburban
true.
areas. We have commuters, right? Few people are local, but by and large, people commute into church on Sundays. It's a dispersed congregation then. And their relation to me as pastor is not as close or intimate as it would be if they lived right across the street from me, right?
Yeah.
So their respect and obedience in relation to me is contingent, and there's lots of factors for this, but I'm just drawing this out as an example then that, local law enforcement, they live in the community, they're law enforcement, they're doing their job, we respect them, we obey them. Pastors, though, I see a dwindling respect for the office of the pastor, not the man, but the office itself. And therefore, obedience to your pastor as your spiritual father has dwindled as well.
Hmm.
But is that because we don't uphold and guard civil righteousness and peace? Or is there something else at play there?
Well, I mean, I think the community aspect is absolutely true. It's a very different thing when there's a possibility that if you're out, in your front yard and your pastor like drives by or walks by,
Sure. Right.
that's going to prick your conscience if you haven't been in church for a bit.
Sure.
Oh, he knows I'm still around,
Right.
I saw him, or I saw him at the grocery store. I saw him at the library, or, or he's at the coffee shop, or he's present. But I also think then that's connected to, like you said, to that civil obedience, civil, engagement. The church, well, this is where the challenge comes in. The church has an interest in the local government, right? Because they help to preserve and protect our ability,
Exactly.
ability to preach the gospel and whatnot. That's pretty much the limit of it, though. Then, but I mean, I don't know. Pastors. Well, I read an article where it was a long, lengthy conversation about how from 37 in the U.S., but how pastors shouldn't run for office. Like, is that actually a thing? Apparently, it was. Where pastors would serve even in local office, like on the school board or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know that. Well, part of the argument is he just doesn't have time, and I think that's probably fair.
Sure.
But on the other hand, it's like, I appreciate now being in a community where it is a community, for one thing,
Right.
and it's small, and people, I can bump into people and I can get to know them, and I can meet people at other churches in the community, and and have we actually have a local paper, and it has a clergy article every week.
Yeah. Yep. Same here.
And we cycle through that. So I mean, I get to.
I don't get asked anymore.
I'm still included. I don't know why.
I was told I'm too judgmental because I only talked about Jesus and the gifts of salvation in my articles, and they said that was too judgmental.
Well, I mean, the guy who runs the paper is a Catholic, so he doesn't seem
Too
to mind me
exclusive.
mentioning Jesus too much. But we have a
That's good
Buddhist
for
that
you.
writes in there too. That's pretty cool.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, same here. They have the Buddhists and the Moravians and the UCC.
We don't have any
people and
Moravian.
The Wiccans. They have a Wiccan. The priestess. She gets to write her article too. But
man, we're really
I think
missing
this is
out.
key then too. I was having a conversation with my trustee after church yesterday, and I said, I more than anybody have been heavy-handed about teaching my congregation that Sunday school and confirmation and church is not a place you bring your kids and drop them off to be taught morals. That here we're going to teach your kids how to be good Christians, and you're going to come to church to learn how to be a good Christian man and woman. But now, especially the past 8 months, I think, because I've had the conversation, I've been ruminating on it. I said to my trustee, I actually think that the church may be one of the last places in our society that actually has a handle on morality.
Yeah.
That we can, because kids aren't being taught it in public schools.
No.
And they're definitely not being taught it through the entertainment industry. And politicians obviously are not examples of morality.
Well, that's what I mentioned, the common trust. I mean, common trust depends upon a common morality.
Yeah. And we don't have one.
And I think I've mentioned this before, but I think it's in the Federalist Papers. It may be somewhere else, but I'm pretty confident it was Madison who said, that the foundation of the Constitution is a common morality, and that's grounded in the Christian truth. I mean, he very much said that.
We talked about that in the last episode. There's the assumption that God gave us certain inalienable rights, that God's established an objective measure for what is good versus what is evil. But also, as we pointed out, there can be no freedom without a theology that inculcates a God whose intent is for us to be free and to serve one another in love.
I mean, you can make the argument that that's more of a deist conception of God. I think that's fair enough. Certainly the case with Jefferson and some others.
100%. Right.
And is it a God that includes Jesus? I mean,
no, but it's a starting point.
Well,
it's at least a baseline.
Can it have a notion of freedom unless it includes Jesus?
In a moral sense, it can have a notion of freedom.
In an earthly moral sense, yeah, I suppose it can. God is constantly redeeming his people, setting them free from earthly bondage. Right. Okay. All right.
But 100%, it's for freedom that Christ has set you free. Therefore, don't be chained up again in bondage to.
It doesn't really change people's lives in the sense of changing their internal disposition.
No, because the civil law, as we discussed, it extends privileges to you. It extends rights.
Right.
But freedom isn't free in a civil sense. It has to be earned every day. You have to fight for your freedom in the civil sense because it's a legal freedom. Freedom in Christ it's done. It's finished. You're free. And then it's up to your preacher to remind you week after week, stop binding yourself to things that are not God. Stop binding yourself to things that cause you to stumble and fall and die.
I think
you're free.
I quoted that in sermons. I mean, don't use your freedom as a cause for vice or for evil.
Correct.
Yeah.
But if we don't have a baseline for good and evil or vice and virtue.
Yeah. Well, what is it today? I mean, what is it today in a secular sense? Where
correct.
I don't even know. I mean, up is down, and what's the Alice in Wonderland quote, right?
It's power.
Well,
Whoever
power
has
is freedom.
Power establishes what is right.
Right. We're gonna liberate a particular, ethnic population, which isn't really an ethnic population, but a color of skin. We're gonna do that through power, and then that's gonna set us free. And you're like, no, then you'll just be the tyrants, and you'll be slaves to your tyranny.
Freedom in that. There's just now the constant need to always be crushing other people to enforce your goodness on them.
And it ends up being its own kind of slavery then.
Exactly. And no, you're a slave to the very people you're oppressing and enslaving, because you can never take your foot off the gas or off their neck.
It's slaves to an ideology, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you claim respect and obedience, but yet are you doing so because you are not leading us to sin? Or you are leading us to sin, and then it's going to be through force and the threat of violence. Then you look at, no, you have to obey a God rather than men. This is when the command to love your neighbor supersedes Romans 13.
Yeah.
So now in the Augsburg Confession, our confession from 1530, that basically said, no, we're not Lutherans, we're Christians. So stop insulting us. Lutherans are Christians, Christians are Lutherans. Defending ourselves against the papacy. The Augustana, then the Augsburg Confession, presupposes the existence of an ordered governing authority, a system of organized governing authorities, and does not directly answer the question of who is to be acknowledged as the proper authority in dubious cases.
This is a really important point.
Such as right now.
Yeah.
The media has nominated and elected their president.
Well, they created a new office.
They really did. Did you see the podium
where
it said projected president?
I
was like, wow.
Well, the office of president-elect doesn't actually
That's
exist.
What it was. Yeah, the office of the president-elect.
I'm sure that's violating some kind of federal law where you use a federal seal and you attach it to something that's not true, but who knows?
Right. I want one for my backdrop. I want one of those. That's fantastic.
Everybody on Twitter is now president-elect.
Correct. Yes. That's all it takes. By the way, that when we talk about being autonomous, that's literally what it means. You're like, I think I'm president now. Well, who elected you? Me.
My law. Yes.
My law. Is every political power which has authority over us to be viewed as a governing authority? The reformers would sharply contradict this explanation of Romans 13 that is so widespread today in 1930. Paul speaks in that passage of the superordinated power, that is, of the legal authorities. The Augsburg Confession introduces this concept of the legitimate, what do you want to say, legitimate ordination?
Yeah, order.
Order. In order to distinguish the governing authority from unordered powers. Just what the marks of the legitimate authority or order, legal orders, there we go, there's the translation, are, according to Article 16 alone, must be acknowledged as good gifts from God. Our confession gives no direct answer. We will treat this omission momentarily.
So what he's saying, and this is a challenge with our use of the Lutheran confessions. And our non-Lutheran people will understand this because, I mean, every church has a set of confessions.
If you're a Calvinist, for example.
Sure. You have 39 articles. If you're Anglican. Yeah. There's different, and they're written and they're timely. They teach the truth, but they don't necessarily anticipate every error that may come. There are things in like the Formula of Concord. Well, right. In the Formula of Concord, I have an article on the descent into hell, and it's kind of the funny one where it says at the beginning, well, we don't think this is going to be a problem, but it might be. So in the future, so we're just going to do a quick little treatise on it. And just so in case you need this in the future, here's what Luther said about, the descent into hell, this kind of slightly difficult thing. Well, it is difficult to demonstrate anything about it. So we'll just give you Luther's opinion and you can just use that.
Exactly. We're not going to overthink this one.
But remember the context of Germany at the time of the Reformation. It's not a country. It's what do you call them? Saxony electorates. Yeah, electorates. It's this loose confederation. And and also loosely affiliated with the Roman Empire, right?
Right.
And they kind of agree to get along. The princes get together and they talk to each other, and they're probably squabbling over borders all the time, that kind of thing, right? But
if you've ever been to Eastern France or Western Germany,
yeah, they're still squabbling about that border. Yeah,
yeah, it's
the
a little, it's a
Alsace.
little porous. Yeah.
So what was I going to say? Oh, the prince kind of just said, "Okay, I'm your governing authority, and I'm also going to tell you what our faith is." And it was just assumed, and there really wasn't like a way out from 1517 to 1580. That's how it was going to be. That was actually
after the 30 Years War, that was the way it was.
It's still even after the 30 Years War, right? You said was it cuius regulo cuius or
regio cuius religio or whatever
in Latin, whatever the religion of the king is the religion of the realm. And they did that pretty much through all of Western Europe, well, until the modern era. Well, yeah, post Enlightenment.
Here's
so
the go ahead.
So no anticipation, which means then people who go to use the Lutheran confession to say this is going to have the answer to every problem, it doesn't necessarily address every problem.
Right.
Okay.
It can if we shoehorn it. The office of the governing authority exists not only within Christendom. There we go. We don't have that anymore.
Nope.
It belongs to God's created order, that is to the order which God gave his fallen creation. And it stands independent from the religious confession of men who exercise it. And maybe this is why, thinking out loud again today, we're, I don't want to say we're wrestling with it because I don't think we are. I think we have simply acquiesced in the sense of we came out of Christendom. We didn't, like writ large, we didn't really recognize that we were moving out of Christendom.
Nope.
And then by the time we recognized that the church was in decline in the United States, going back to what I talked about kind of the office of the pastor, for example, losing its authority and respect. And now, rather quickly, churches are just shut down and closed permanently. So we didn't really get much time to get used to not being in a Christendom world before, hey, we're broken, we have to close forever because COVID.
Oh, where the church was being supported by the state.
Yes.
In particular. Right.
Now
but
it's more than antagonistic in certain states.
Well, and there's some remnant though. I noticed, I acknowledge
right, exactly.
this.
And that's what I was going to bring up though, is that within the churches, the whole reason we're reading this is because there's a remnant of this that remains in the churches.
Well, I've
but
seen
I think
that's
an added wrinkle. The added wrinkle is, like I said, I'm talking about this in relation to God and objective reality.
Oh, yeah.
Versus the state or the community, which is talking about it in the absence of God altogether.
I don't necessarily agree with that. Because
in my state.
Well, in your state, well, no, that's true. Your state is unique this way in that you have non-Christian governing authorities. Some very famous ones, right?
Well, openly socialist.
Yeah, which is atheistic or Islam, Muslim, which isn't even another whole conversation. But but when was we've had? I'm just trying to think like presidential candidates. They've all been affiliated with some Christian church. And actually I would say probably most of the senators, United States senators and legislators, there are probably some atheists in there. I'd say the socialists are by nature, right? And then we have some other faith traditions in there, Indian or whatever.
Sure.
Hindi and Muslim, but it's not common. And I think that's a remnant. I don't know, because, well, obviously, just like we have Republican or Democrat in name only, we also have Christian in name only too.
Yeah.
So to what degree, for example, are you a Roman Catholic if you support abortion? I can't like reconcile those two, being not a Roman Catholic, but like that's a pretty prominent public position for the Roman Church. and not
for
really
Orthodox Roman Catholicism.
Yeah, certainly for the priesthood and for the official dogma, whether or not it's practiced, or it shouldn't be practiced, enforced, I guess. How do you even enforce it anyway? I suppose that's another whole challenge. But we have that remnant where there's this assumption that I need to be religiously affiliated in order to serve in public office.
Right.
And I think it has to do with this idea that you can't order society without having some ordered life in relationship to God.
Right. So that's my question, thinking out loud through this, because I don't have the answer and I'm not leading with my questions for those of you listening. I'm genuinely
I'm not either
about this conversation is, if it belongs to God's created order,
Mhm.
and then you within the church are trying to interface with the state at the local or state level, and they're not down with God's created order, they don't see this as an objective reality,
Right.
you're arguing past each other
Oh yeah,
about higher
absolutely.
and lower authority and about which law is absolute or ultimate.
Mhm.
And
Well, we've talked about that with abortion. That the
right.
best argument in the secular sphere is not this is what God says.
Mm-hmm.
It's like just use science.
Yeah.
Here fetal heartbeat,
Right.
or ultrasounds, or embryology, which is pretty evocative.
Right.
Is it entirely convincing? Not if you don't want to believe it.
Right.
But it actually, I mean, we've learned this in like women's shelters, or not women's shelters. What do you call it? Where you set up the clinic next to the abortion clinic. I don't know, where we do ultrasounds and other ways
Mm-hmm.
to help the woman make a better decision
Mm-hmm.
based off of reality and not just
Right.
what she feels or thinks.
Well, but that's the thing too. You just use the term better, which assumes a moral framework.
Mhm. Of course it does. Yeah.
That there are better or worse decisions, but without a moral framework, how do you establish, again, a baseline for what is better or worse
Well, and this is that Twitter thread
versus
that
the yes or no of my own personal tastes?
well, the Twitter thread I started up today, I was going to try to drive towards this, and some people did in the response.
Pastor Gillespie woke up and decided to start a dumpster fire on his phone.
I don't know. I just threw out one idea.
You must have been really optimistic after that first cup of coffee.
I had just
This
gotten
can't
off
go
the
wrong.
bike. I had just gotten off the bike.
Oh, okay, I gotcha.
No, that we actually, I mean, from Romans, St.
Mhm.
Paul's letter to Romans, we actually do have a law that's written upon our hearts from God.
Right.
So this natural order, or what did he call it? The order, legal orders, created order. That's what he uses here. It's written upon our hearts. The problem is that, we have a pretty low anthropology. We know that despite having that, we also
Right.
have a contradictory, if you like, ethic or order,
Mhm.
or disorder, really sinful disorder.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
that's constantly in operation against God's created order, which is on our heart. And
Correct.
that's gets to the idea of the image of God, right, which is written upon us.
Right.
And
So
we say, we have to go there.
So here's the added wrinkle then. Sasse
Mhm.
continues, no matter which peoples Christians live among, they must acknowledge the current legal authorities, quote, be they pagan or Christian, unquote, as governing authorities established by God, and be obedient to the applicable laws. That's the point, right?
Yep.
You have a socialist who is anti-God, but
Mhm.
plays at being, let's say, a God-fearing believer for the sake of getting elected.
Right.
They're established by God to rule over you.
Yeah, but for what benefit?
Exactly. What is it repentance?
I hope so.
Is that the benefit?
I mean, it's the
Go
wrath
back
of
to the
God
scripture.
against unbelief.
That's what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. That it's the wrath of God saying, hey, here's what you deserve, that I might repent you and you might be saved.
Well, I think we could
So
say
does that mean in my generation, or does that mean to the third or fourth generation?
Well, I mean, elections do have consequences, as somebody famously quipped.
Mm-hmm.
Or many people have. I would say what we're seeing now is, with the election cycle is, it's been ramping up the last few cycles, every 4 years, every 2 years. And the reason being is exactly what we both put our finger on, is that right and wrong, good and evil, like a common morality, or even just a respect for created order, for an inherent order that's I think apparent just through reason and sense, but apparently not for a lot of people. They look at like their body parts and they say, those don't belong to me. And you're like, what's wrong with you? It's like, well, you don't have to like them, but that's what you were given, right?
Right.
And that, but that's that inherent contradiction that we're always running against, where God says one thing, and he says it in different ways, not just with his word, but through creation. And then we say, no, we don't like that.
Right. Well, and I'm reflecting on my own state, because it's churches reacted originally to the sheltered home orders, and then when our church body sued my governor to open back up in May, people were very confused because the authorities and the other church body that was also Lutheran said, we're suing you
Yeah.
for promoting sin. because you're forbidding us from preaching the gospel and administering the sacraments. So people in general, like, what's the difference? and the answer is, well, those politically, and then full stop.
Yeah.
To the average person then on the street, that may be a adequate answer politically, ideologically for them, philosophically, but that's not the full depth of that conversation, because it's not to be had publicly.
Right.
It's not allowed to be had publicly, because at least in my state, the local media runs interference for the party that's in authority and has been in office for 40 plus years.
Right.
The GOP is essentially running under the umbrella of the Democratic Party that's been in power for over 40 years, because that's how you get elected in the state. So you have basically a one-party system with two names. You have a local media that runs interference for the governor and the local mayors in Minneapolis and St. Paul, regardless.
Right.
And any, like we had one legislator who's a doctor who questioned the death certificates that were being fraudulently filed.
Right.
And he was anonymously reported for medical malpractice twice, had to defend himself twice against the calls that he should be, have his license removed from him.
And then ultimately he just gave up.
And no, he's fighting. He fought. He's a good man.
Good for him.
And very good man. And 90% of the state votes one way, conservative, and then the Duluth, Minneapolis, St. Paul vote blue every time.
90% as far as geography.
Have an overwhelming majority of people as far as geography, exactly, not according to population and districting. So in my state, anyways, in Minnesota, it's a very clear line of, here's the churches, here's the different churches and how they approach their relationship to the state. Here's the population, and they have very distinct approaches to how they approach their interfacing with the state and therefore the churches. And that's how it finds its way into the local community then, is you have two churches, both the named Lutheran, but one church says, no, we will stay locked down and closed until the governor says we can open again. Mm-hmm. And the other says, go kick rocks. But because we don't have a broad conversation about morals and ethics, about the relation of the church to the state, and then you have competing worldviews and competing messages, I understand, I can appreciate why people are so confused, and why now, like in Minnesota, there's conflict between the churches, because there's conflict between the people and their communities, even in their own families.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other unfortunate thing is that the church is the foundation of kind of this common morality. It was undermined first in the church.
Yes.
Well, maybe, yeah, I think it was first in the church, or at least the first attack vector of, say, the common philosopher was on the church, because they recognize that the church does. I mean, we as pastors, we form culture.
Right.
We inform people who they are and how they relate to one another. What's good, what's bad, what's helpful, what's not.
Right.
And if they can attack that, or at least change our mind, then they can change it. They can change the culture around us. Yeah.
An interesting anecdote. A friend of mine who taught at the seminary in Kazakhstan pointed out that under the Soviet Union and Soviet rule, excuse me, in the 1950s, 2 in 5 people informed on their neighbors to the government, which means if you were a family of 5, when you sat down to eat dinner, at least 2 people at the table were informing on the rest of the family to the government. And so when you went to church on Sunday, everybody knew that somebody in church was an informant. And the reason that and that's how they ruled, that's how the Soviet Union managed the churches. They didn't have to send government agents to every church in the Soviet Union, like in Kazakhstan. They just had to get people to realize your neighbor is watching your every move and they will inform on you.
Didn't I send you the that school in Texas? It was Rice, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Did you read that article about?
I started, yeah.
Oh my goodness. I mean, talk about, it sounds like that. It sounds like the Russian state. Like, if you can't be on campus, if you don't comply in every degree at every time, they're encouraging you to inform on one another.
Right.
And then you have to make like public apology if you like endangered somebody else's life.
Public shaming. It happened in Minneapolis.
Whew. And it's done. I mean, you have to willingly engage in it because if you go to the university, you're saying, I'm going to do this.
Exactly. Yep.
You can't be non-compliant or you will get excluded.
And by the way, this is how Sasse was ostracized and vilified in Germany, is the exact same thing.
Yeah, ultimately.
That neighbors were informing on each other to survive. In church. in church, because there were certain things, like, for example, I talked about the woman that I took care of that was a member of the Hitler Youth, and she talked about you weren't allowed to read from the Old Testament. It didn't exist in Germany. They burned all the Old Testaments. They ripped them out of the Bibles. You had the New Testament because Jesus was Teutonic. He wasn't a Jew. And so until she was 28 years old, she had never seen an Old Testament or read one.
Wow.
So whenever we would talk, she loved hearing me read from the Old Testament. And we think nowadays, well, that could never happen. Like, that's not possible. It's like, yeah, actually, in my community, there are people who are informing on local businesses for not enforcing the mask policy and social distancing. They're already doing it.
Right. Well, and they're going to inform on us if we gather for
Thanksgiving
church.
and Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
Yeah, they will. Maybe not this round, but by next year, it's entirely possible.
Oh, but it's all going away, right?
So continuing with Sasse, also in the non-Christian world, the reformers had in view the example of the Turks, that's the Muslims. There is a legal order in which the original knowledge of all men lives on as an eternal norm for what is just.
So we're talking about, yeah. Original.
Everywhere on earth, there are stations in which men live according to some legal order. Everywhere there is, even if sin has blunted it, a consciousness of right and wrong. Lewis talks about this in Mere Christianity, right?
Sure.
You get up to go to the bathroom when you're on a train, and you come back and someone's in your seat, and you say, hey, man, you're in my seat. Your name's not on it. It's like, no, you know inherently, you saw me sitting there, you saw me get up and go to the bathroom, and you took my seat. That's wrong.
It's like a right to property almost.
Right.
Or possession of some sort. Yeah.
Right. And so we know inherently we're conscious of right and wrong. However, it's blunted by sin, as he points out. And then when it's socialized, when it's normalized, right and wrong get flipped upside down and backwards. This goes back to the double speak and all this stuff of Orwellianism and even Brave New World, is that by Huxley, is that there are stations, and each person in their station, in their heart, according to natural law, knows this is how I serve and love my neighbors.
Stay in your lane, right?
Stay in your lane. So therefore, as a pastor, for example, I do not go out to the farm of my organist and start lecturing her husband on how to grow corn.
Plant, plow, any of that.
Plow, any of that stuff. Likewise, then when her husband comes to church and lectures me on being a pastor, I want to say, hey, man, stay in your lane. But I don't, because I love him and he doesn't listen to me. It goes to the point.
That's called risk assessment. Yes.
Right. Exactly. That's right. Read the room, baby. But the point is, yeah, stay in your lane. If this natural understanding of the just, in which form it may appear alongside of the positive right, did not exist, then humanity would not last long. Ta-da!
Key point. Yep.
That's where we're at right now. That's where we're at.
Why don't we devolve into chaos, disorder, mass murder, genocide? Well, actually, that happens all the time.
Right.
And where does it happen?
Where there's no law and order.
Correct.
There's no stopgaps.
Nope.
I was listening to a podcast the other day that former cop got fired actually for making a video during the early days of COVID telling other cops, hey, man, don't be so heavy-handed in enforcing these regulations. Be cool. Again, you live in these communities. So be cool with these people. Do not use this as an opportunity to be heavy-handed and alienate and vilify yourself and the police force. Be cool. Again, use the spirit of the law, not the letter. And it wasn't even a law, it was a mandate. Still is a mandate.
Right.
Point is, he got fired for the video because he wouldn't take it down. He's also a former Ranger and former CIA operative and then a cop. So he's got a very strong sense of service and right and wrong. And that's why he wouldn't take the video down. And now he's got his own podcast. He owns his own jiu-jitsu academy. But the point he said is, I really wish that all the police would quit for a month.
And just
then
people let things
really
go to
see
hell.
what life would be. He's like, it would be The Purge. If you've never seen the movie The Purge, it would be The Purge.
When there are like 15 sequels.
Yeah.
It's not hard.
And the host said, the former Navy SEAL host is like, whoa. How about instead of that, you just go on strike for 24 hours. All the police in America go on strike for 24 hours. How long do you think it would be before it was complete and absolute post-apocalyptic chaos? And the former cop said 20 minutes. Because as soon as you find out, as soon as it's announced and you realize, oh, I can do whatever I want and no one's going to come and arrest me or stop me, you're going to find out what's truly in men's hearts.
Yeah. Well, and that was the point I was trying to make earlier, and that's the argument I was getting into on the Twitter, is that you know, the assumption that people are inherently good.
Right.
And I mean, it's hard because we see things that we would call civic righteousness, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Where people do well. We've talked about the noble savage.
Mm-hmm.
There's different ways to describe this. But the question is why,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, what is the motivation for them to do well or good according to like some common standard that we agree
Sure.
upon? What is the motivation? It's shame and guilt cultures, right?
Yeah.
We have that. Oh, two different kinds of culture, right? Shame, public shame. So you go against the tribe, or guilt.
Right.
There's law, and there's going to be consequence if you go
Right.
against it, right? And you say that those are the curbs or the fence or the lanes that keep you operating within, this framework, right? If you didn't have that, then it literally is a free for all. And I listened. You mentioned Michael Malice before. I didn't know he was an anarchist. I should have known. Now that that he just came out and said, "Oh,
he's a pure anarchist, not anarchist and like let's burn everything down and loot." Like he's a true anarchist.
Well, I mean, you might say like a libertarian.
Leave me alone, and I'll take care of myself.
Right, but that's actually a conservative position. Like
that's why he gets along with conservatives.
That's actually a conservative position to say, look, I'm not gonna. There's going to be, I know there's a high level framework that's going to govern, at a national level or a state level, right? But in my little, just let me be just leave me alone, right?
Right.
I'm gonna take care of myself. I'm not going to hurt or harm anybody. You're like, okay, so you still have, you're not an anarchist in a sense that there is no order,
right?
Right.
No,
because
the
that's
order
what
is
the word
established for a functional anarchist. The order is established by the fact that we all agree to live according to a social contract.
Right. Oh, there's the word social contract. I said social trust before. I was trying to think of contract.
Live and let live.
Right. But that's not the word anarchy. That's not what it means. It means without order.
Right.
So you can't be a pure anarchist then.
No, because it's human nature doesn't allow it. But it's kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an anarchistic organization. That is, we have no head, we have no leader, there's no president. And yet
there's rules.
There's rules. And I was a district representative from one of my AA groups, and we had meetings, and I can tell you it was a dumpster fire, getting a whole bunch of alcoholics to try and stay organized and not dominate the room. Man, you put 24 alcoholics in a room, and all of them are trying to dominate the conversation because they're all passive aggressive and codependent. I did my time and I got out real fast. I was like, this is not conducive to sobriety.
So here's the question. How's that compare to a voters assembly?
Oh, Midwest, it's much more lively. It's much more lively.
It's more lively.
Less crying. Less crying.
That's funny.
Yeah. But the point is, there's no such thing as true anarchy because it would be just Mad Max.
Well, and ultimately, humanity would not last long. That's what Sasse says. And I think he's absolutely right. Yeah. I always ask the kids this question. They're like, why do bad things happen? I'm like, well, why are you still alive?
Right.
I mean, the better question is why isn't there more evil?
Because of us.
Yeah.
Here's the point, I think anyways, is that it's a Diogenes situation. Diogenes was a famous philosopher, lived in a barrel. He said that it's all nonsense. It's all just random. It doesn't matter. And I've said this before, in order for Diogenes to say that, there was an entire group of soldiers who guarded the walls of the city that he lived in every day. And there were people that gave him food from their own kitchens every day.
And the irony was lost on him?
Apparently. And and I read about that when I was like 14 or 15. I realized it at 14 or 15. I was like, oh, this dude's no.
That's called a freeloader, isn't it?
Yeah, he's a freeloader. But the point I would argue at the present tense then is the same thing, is that as our society descends into chaos because we vilify law and order and we don't want it and we don't respect right and wrong.
Well, I'd say 76 million people don't seem to care that much. But
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's up to, like I said, though, another group of people to step up and say, no, we're going to hold the line. Just like in the church. If every church around you is saying, we're not going to open because we're going to comply with the state. And then you say, well, we're going to open because the gospel must be preached and the sacraments must be administered. And if you want to come and arrest me, I'll do prison ministry. Great. Awesome. Wherever I go, I'll preach. Point is, at a certain point, you either have to stand up for what's right, or you're compliant with you are complicit in advocating for sin.
Well, I figure my community, we have a rod and gun club here in town.
There you go. Nice.
So I'm pretty confident that if we needed to, set up barricades and defend our town, we could do it.
No,
We
I
could-
know. I'm completely comfortable with my situation.
Right.
Like I have the least amount of guns probably in this entire town. So
Yeah, we do too.
right. The point is though, is that God will not abandon a nation, just like again, going back to Judges and Gideon.
Yeah, good
God
point.
will not abandon a nation completely.
Right.
Right. There will be 7,000 prophets in Israel. He raises up Gideon and says, go town to town and raise a militia. And Gideon's like, I'm super skeptical. He's like, no, you'll do it.
Not that
And
many though. What was it, like
10,000?
Yeah.
It was like 10,000 to start, and then he whittled it down to 300. He's like,
oh,
too
that's
many.
right, with the whole dog thing.
Yeah, too
the
many.
water.
Too many. I just need 300, and you're not going to fight. It's kind of fun story there. But the point is then that whether it's civic righteousness and peace, eventually there are going to be people who stand up and say, no, we're going to, and I don't mean in violent sense. I mean in the sense of like, no, we're going to hold the line for more moral good and evil, right and wrong.
Right.
And we're going to teach our kids and teach the next generation. Listen, if the church is the only place that's going to teach civil righteousness and righteousness in relation to Christ, so be it.
Right. Yeah.
Because
and
if not us, who?
Right. So if your state or your local law enforcement or your national law enforcement no longer protect body and external possessions, as the confession says, or guard civil righteousness and peace, then locally you'll have to step up.
People will step up, right?
They will, right? Because, like I said, they inherently know that that's right.
Correct.
It's written on their
now,
heart.
How we manifest that goes back to the blunted by sin part of it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Will we do it without sin? No, of course not.
No, of course not.
It will be imperfect. Yeah, it'll be imperfect.
But without a conversation, a public conversation, it will take place in homes. It will take place in churches. It will take place in bars and restaurants. It will take place in coffee shops. Or it will just take place underground. You see that fight club that was busted up in New York City?
No.
200 people.
That seems unwise to try to bust up a fight club.
Well, like that's the first rule, dude. Who talked? Like it's the first rule.
Oh.
Somebody talked. The cops went in and busted it up.
Oh man.
Yeah. Like again, it's always one. It's just one guy.
And God will do it. I mean, that's the other aspect.
Right.
He doesn't will the death of the sinners, but they repent. Right. So that's the other aspect that he hasn't brought up yet. I don't know if he does, but the idea that why preserve the state, why preserve this word? It's for the sake of the gospel, right? So that others would hear the good news of Jesus and be saved. If they're dead, they can't hear.
Right. 100%.
Yeah.
That's the psalmist's lament. Dead can't praise you.
Yeah. How can those in Sheol? Right.
So back to the point then, to the order of nature by which the world is maintained, such as the exchange of winter and summer, that nature runs its course according to laws.
Right.
The stars and the constellation, they're dictated by laws, and so are we. Whether we want to acknowledge it or not, this is the way of the world.
This is the way.
This is the way. This acknowledgement then of the governing authority as a universal created order reflects exactly the doctrine of the New Testament. The church at the time of the apostles had acknowledged the Roman government as the governing authority established by God, insofar as it fulfilled the functions of a governing authority.
There's the word, insofar.
Insofar as it was the shield of justice and peace. Going back to the martyr episode.
Right.
There were certain Christians who are like, no, 100%, dude, we want to be martyred. Like, do it. Like,
and that's weird. Yeah, that's weird.
And then he's like, no, don't do that, dude. That's not vocational. That's not God's will. Right? If you are martyred for your faith, praise be to God. God giveth, the Lord taketh. Praise be the Lord. However, don't run into the jaws of the lion. That's suicide. That's prohibited.
No, it's that reluctant dissidence.
Right.
Like we don't intentionally go out of our way for a fight, but if you bring the fight to us, we will defend.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
But,
well, it's either that or we just die as weaklings or something. Yeah, just be defeated.
We're the fig tree. Yeah, we're the figs.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Fig tree. So the church rendered its obedience so far, or the church rendered the Roman government obedience so far as it could do so without sin, and as long as the pagan authorities remained within their proper legal sphere. This is Jesus's point with the coin.
Right.
Pay your taxes. Don't worship him. He's not God.
Oh, but nobody asked me after the sermon, well, Pastor, you said that a 40 to 60% income tax is within their right. I was hoping somebody would push back on that. Be like, that seems unjust.
That seems a little excessive. Yes. Right.
But I mean, how would you defend that
Right.
from the scripture?
Right.
Say, look, if you're choosing to use their currency, then you got to submit to their rules. That's the only alternative, is that instead of using their currency, you
mint
do
your own.
you barter.
Mhm.
I'll do this for you, you do that for me.
Right.
No cash. We're just going to take care of each other.
A
Then
no
there's
cash society. Imagine what that would look like.
But no, I don't.
2030.
Oh, you mean one cash society? Oh, you mean no paper money? Got it.
No paper, cashless currency
that has
printed
no value.
money. It's like somebody pointed out yesterday. I thought it was funny. They're like, oh, so COVID can be passed along on money, but not on newspapers printed by the media. Interesting.
Yeah, there's double standards all through.
I was like, oh, that's kind of funny. I like that.
Yeah, I like it.
So yeah, so far as it could do so without sin, the church was obedient to the Roman government.
No.
But we don't worship Caesar as a god. When the governing authority transgressed its lawful limits, as happened in the cult of Caesar, and demanded not only rule over the body, but also over the soul, there the saying applied, one must obey God rather than men. Thus the struggle between Christ and Caesar broke out, which Christendom kind of resolved dishonestly.
By compromising both church and state.
Right, there we go. That's a better way of saying it. Mixing the two together, not holding the tension.
And then they're both so diluted that they
which is why in the present tense, then you have so many churches who are like, what are you doing? Don't push back. Don't ask why. Obey God, Caesar.
Well, it makes a better civil government.
Sure,
if you push back, if you require the courts to judge and to have proper laws and not to overreach. I mean, that tension is constantly at play.
Right.
And it makes both of you better. It actually makes the church better too. If it recognizes here's our authority, here's where it ends, here's where it's their authority.
Telling the trustee yesterday, there was a time in this country that churches essentially ran the social services.
Right.
The church was the charitable. We were known as the charitable organization that we were. That's kind of how churches were defined, publicly speaking. They were charitable. They took care of the widow and the orphan.
See how they love one another. Yeah.
They loved it. Exactly. Whereas after the Second World War in particular, we abdicated that and gave more and more of that away to the state because we were flush.
Well, arguably it was before World War II with FDR.
It was. I'm just saying, like, in popularly writ large, you see this in the 50s and 60s where the churches just moved further and further away from that. So yes, individual churches and local church bodies may engage in charitable causes and serve the community charitably. Writ large, that's not necessarily how the church is known anymore.
No, not really.
Especially not, like you said, pre-World War II, pre-FDR. But it was still very clearly defined then. And then the 20s and 30s, you had like the suffragette movement and so forth. But even before that, you had the abolitionist movement, where Christians weren't saying we need to overthrow the government, but they were saying this is unjust, this is wrong, this is contrary to God's will, and this is sin.
Fair enough.
You don't see that very much anymore.
You see it a little bit.
Exactly.
In some of the little bit. Maybe like in the new, I guess we call it conservative media, the alternative media. You see people who are willing to stand up. I mentioned to you in a comment this morning, Candace Owens would be an example. Speaking to a very particular community, speaking as a Christian,
right?
But speaking in political sphere as a Christian to her community, of African Americans. That's a very kind of targeted and unique application. But she does speak the truth to power. And I don't know how successful she is. It seems to be there were more conservative, African American voters this run around than we've had in 60 years, I think is what the stat was, pretty much.
Yeah. So
it does seem to be convincing. People are like, you know what? Having fathers in our homes, that would actually be a really good idea.
Right.
Like, go figure. That's part of that natural order that God created. So let's reinforce that and support that.
Right. So we obey God rather than men. That's where the struggle between Christ and Caesar breaks out, as reflected in the revelation of St. John. It is not Caesar who was the enemy of Christ, but Caesar the God, who placed himself in the throne of God. This is the problem with socialists, is that they raise the state up, meaning themselves, in the place of God. They are the ultimate authority. Their word is law.
Yeah. So the
There
state
is
is no
no
longer subordinate to God.
correct.
Mhm.
I pointed this out yesterday.
I did too.
A long history of Christian resistance in the church up until very recently in this country. And by resistance, I don't mean, again, violence. I mean resistance in the sense of standing up and saying, slavery is evil. We need to stop this.
Hmm. Yeah, and doing their part where they could.
Right.
Hmm.
So Caesar the God placed himself in the throne of God. The doctrine of our confession directly reflects these thoughts of Holy Scripture.
Oh, thank goodness for that.
So, and this is the point on our side of the street then as Lutherans, is that for Lutheran church bodies to reject this
Hmm.
is to reject our own confession that this is actually a faithful exposition of the Scriptures.
Correct. Yep.
So you're not only saying, yeah, that Lutheran stuff, we don't care. That Reformation stuff, that's not relevant. But you're saying that it's not even a faithful exposition of God's word that helps guide and direct our actions.
Yeah, as
Our
citizens
confession.
and as rulers,
Right.
Yeah.
So then again, to my point, thinking out loud, how can we even talk to each other when we don't even have a baseline? Where do you start from when your presuppositions are so skewed in the opposite direction?
Yeah.
Both civilly and theologically.
No,
Then what do you do?
It's a good point. I mean,
Because even when I talk with Christians who are pacifists, and I have friends who are pacifists, and they've said, if there was a draft, for example,
Mhm.
I would be a conscientious objector. I understand where they're coming from, and I respect what they're saying. But the reason is because we have a baseline to operate from
Right.
to have that conversation. And they're rejecting something that I affirm, but we're
Right.
coming from the same place as far as how we're working that conversation, the lexicon, the language, the theology.
Yeah. Well, and I think on the life issue, that's another one where there's some strange contradictions where you say, well, the life in the womb is less valuable than the murderer on death row.
Sure.
So we're, being against capital punishment. You're like, can you wait? That's a double. How can you be against capital punishment, but for effectively capital punishment for unwanted children?
Correct.
Like that's unjust. And it's not even a double standard. It's something far worse than that. I can't even,
It's just dissonance. It's
yeah,
a
it's
cognitive dissonance.
incredible dissonance. And like, well, either life is valuable or it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm not necessarily a huge capital punishment person, although I think it is a pretty effective teaching tool. Although I don't necessarily, I mean, it's within the government's right.
Yeah and no. I would argue yes and no.
Yeah. I mean,
We
I don't
keep executing people, but people keep doing it.
Well, there's that. Well, that's always going to be imperfect. But that's not necessarily an excuse. I think
That's why Luther in the Schmalkald article is actually called as the failed use of the law.
Oh yeah,
the first use.
Well, and especially now with like DNA testimony and whatnot. I mean, we've seen that not every death row inmate is actually
but
should
the fact
be
of the
there.
matter is there are just certain people, as the U.S. military has pointed out within the last couple days. Number 2 got taken out.
Oh yeah, in Iran.
Yeah.
What's the Al Qaeda guy doing in Iran?
Weird.
I don't
Why
know.
would he be in Iran?
And like, why did it just get announced now?
Yeah, why? So strange.
And what's Israel doing in Iran?
So strange. Well, Israel goes wherever they want, but
well, they do, right? What's their Secret Service people call their
Mossad?
Mossad, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the point is though that there are certain people that you go, hey man, I've noticed that you really seem to like killing people.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really seem like you're going to stop.
That's unacceptable.
So we're going to stop you. Again, this goes back to Augustine and just war. The authorities have stood up and said, listen.
Yeah, that's true.
Again, this aggression will not stand, man.
Yeah.
At a certain point.
Capital punishment is related to war.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's more domestic though, I guess is the difference. Yeah.
But then to your point, then we can look at an adult and say, okay, this person has transgressed the boundary of right and justice so many times, or what they did is so egregiously evil that, and they've said, listen, you let me out. Cause you've watched interviews with people on death row before. And there's been people who are like, yeah, if you let me out, I'm going to do this again.
Watch Mindhunter, for example.
Yeah. Watch Mindhunter, which is based on an actual, team of investigators.
Right.
Who essentially invented modern pathology and
psychology,
yeah,
criminal psychology. Yeah.
criminal psychology. Thank you. Point is, though, there are certain adults that you go, okay, no, but to say to a child, we're going to apply the same standard.
It's it's just
Or even
grossly
reversed.
unjust. It's grossly unjust. I guess that's
Right.
the point.
And
Yeah.
George Carlin draws this out. He's like, oh, you're pro-abortion, but you're pro-life, but pro-death penalty. It's like, so you're against aborting a human being up to 9 months, but you're not against aborting a person in the 3,196th trimester or something like that. It's like, well, there's a difference there.
Yeah, qualitatively. Yeah.
Qualitatively. But if you want to reduce it to just binary terms, then yeah, it is actually a stupid argument.
You know, the movie that keeps coming up in my head, not in this conversation, but in the last few days, is because we've been talking about genetic manipulation. That's another thing coming up in the Human Genome Project, but now like modifying it with CRISPR and whatnot.
You mean like getting an injection that modifies your RNA?
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay.
So that made me think of Gattaca, right?
Yeah, great movie.
Where you have the guy who's supposed to be the superior athlete and he ends up paralyzed, right?
Yeah.
And is his life worth living?
Right. That scene where on the beach where he's scraping his skin with a seashell.
That's it's intense.
That's a powerful scene.
Well, there's just some great acting in there, Ethan Hawke and whatnot. But but then the other one is Minority Report, which has come up quite a bit, and the idea of thought crime, that we can actually punish somebody for something they might do in the future,
or just punish somebody for thinking the wrong way.
And I mean that's going to require some kind of human brain, AI interaction for that to probably play out, because we're not going to have precogs like.
Or just somebody to comb through your social media posts.
Right. So I mean, there does seem to be some boundaries. Well, that's the social media score. We've talked about that in the last show, I think. There has to be some boundaries to the law, but on the other hand, I mean, the law does have its purpose.
Yeah.
So you called it a dichotomy or a tension, and it's constantly at play. There's no perfect law. There's no perfect governance.
Right.
But that doesn't say that we should abandon it entirely, because it is, it's the conflict between God's created order again and the way that we sinfully rebel against it.
For Minneapolis, the city council to not defund the police, but abolish the police, and then murder goes up 91%. And now they're going to bring in outside people to supplement the police because the police quit and they won't let the police do the job.
So the solution was worse than
the solution is way worse
than
and then the solution to the solution, it makes it even worse because it's just compounding bad decision making. And the only people that are going to suffer the consequences are the people in Minneapolis, in those areas.
What's the American's mayor say? Oh, the cover-up's worse than the crime.
Correct. So what's going to happen, and this is going to happen, is you're going to have neighborhood watches, you're going to have local militias, block to block, neighborhood to neighborhood, who are saying, yeah, we can't depend on the city, we can't depend on the mayor, we can't depend on the police force, we got to take care of ourselves. Otherwise, we got to
that's more than community watch. Like community militia.
Yeah, there's a lot of houses for sale in Minneapolis.
I imagine so. This reminds me.
Ideology meets reality.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Again, I have a friend who's a vegan / really strong pro Second Amendment person now. Whereas a year ago, vegan, very anti Second Amendment.
I like the way that as much as this conflict has been a terrible experience for pretty much everybody,
it's exposed everybody.
It has, and it's also then created these alignments that are new, where you have basically, what did Ann and I say last night? I was listening to Weinstein, Brett, and she's like, I like this guy. He's using his brain. I don't agree with everything he says, but I like it.
Right.
I'm like, right. Yes, exactly. So that's the alignment that's happening, is that you have thinking, quote unquote, conservatives and thinking liberals. I mean, arguably liberals think, not leftists or rightists, or any of this definition, just people who have maybe a different conclusion, but they're both wanting to work through the argument.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
And they want to do it together and moderate each other's position.
Right.
Recognizing that they don't know everything. Ultimately, if those two, groups of people, if you want to even classify them that way, if they don't come together, then all we end up with these polar opposites that ultimately will destroy each other.
And maybe if anything positive has come out of this so far, it's that people are waking up to the fact that we have to stop relying on other people to do it for us. Well, that's somebody else's job.
Depending on the external institutions.
Because you can go back to what you said about, learning to stay in your lane. What's your station in life?
Mm-hmm.
There's a station. And if that is empty and there's a void there, somebody's going to fill it.
Right. Well, we can't rely upon, the government to teach us what it means to be a civil servant.
No.
Or to be,
we can't rely on the government to teach us what's moral or
right.
just.
Or just, that's right.
Or protect the peace. I mean, in a lot of cases.
Or even what's healthy. I mean, we grew up with the food pyramid.
That ship sailed a long time ago.
So it's crazy.
Right.
I mean, so the people say, well, we can't trust external authorities. Why did you?
Right.
I mean, why did not? You were supposed to always be skeptical, put them to the test, compare what they're saying to what the data says.
Mm-hmm.
And for some reason, maybe it was just contentment, or it was just easy or lazy.
Privilege. We had the privilege of carrying on as if, like you said, voting doesn't really have real world consequences.
Because
your team wins, their team wins, and it's a nuance. It's just a different riff, but it's the same song.
Oh, because both teams had a common goal, but they just had kind of a different way of going about it.
Sure.
Okay.
That was kind of, at least in my experience of talking to and listening to people talk about their votes and how they, express what they think this means. Yeah, whatever. I'll vote or I don't. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Whereas this time, it seems a lot of people think it matters.
We did have a consensus figure in Reagan, at least.
Mm-hmm.
I know the religious right liked him, but he won a large portion of the population.
Every state except Minnesota.
Yeah, twice.
Mm-hmm.
So as being a moderate position where probably nobody was happy with him, but everybody was content.
Sure. Well, gave birth to the punk rock movement. So,
well, there's that too. So that's a good
him
gift.
And Thatcher.
So, those two.
So if the governing authority remaining within its limits is part of God's order of creation, if the state also essentially belongs to the order of creation and not to the order of salvation, then there can be no Christian state. Indeed, the bearers of the governing office may be Christian. From them may be demanded a special consciousness of the nature of their office and a special measure of performance of duty, but their duties are the same, which all governing authorities on earth have. There is as little possibility of a Christian state as there is of Christian agriculture, Christian technology. I would add to that Christian music,
Christian plumbers,
literature, Christian anything, because it's all borrowing from Greco-Roman standards and rules. The harsh "we condemn" of the Augsburg Confession would strike the later Lutheran advocates of the doctrine of the Christian state as much as Roman Christianity and the Schwärmer, if it could have foreseen this later falsification of evangelical Lutheran doctrine. God's word provides no state law, which is proven in my state, because we don't have marriage in my state anymore. We have civil unions.
Right. Is that okay?
Did they change the definition? Yeah, it makes it easier for me to reject it.
Right.
And say, that's the kingdom on the left, and in the kingdom on the right, we have holy matrimony.
Well, what about when you can't? I mean, that's the question, right? When do they say, no, you have to perform this?
Then I will perform none.
Yeah. I mean, that's the only alternative, isn't it?
Right. No.
Sorry. Thanks. No, thanks.
Yeah, no. Because it's not a matter of salvation, marriage, and therefore not a sacrament, and therefore it's not my problem.
Well, and it's not eternal. I mean, it's temporal.
That's the point, in Jesus' own words.
Right.
So in the apology to the Augsburg Confession, which is very, very long because Philip Melanchthon was very, very agitated about the Roman Catholic response to the Augsburg Confession.
Arguably rightly so.
And rightly so, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Karlstadt is called dumb and foolish because he taught that one should establish city and territorial government according to the law of Moses. Andreas Karlstadt was a big fan of Luther. He taught on the faculty at Wittenberg with Luther. And then Luther chastised him in a very famous episode from 1522-ish. And after that, Karlstadt decided that he was more Luther than Luther.
And he went and found other people who agreed with him.
And the heavenly prophets. And they were the ones who smashed the stained glass windows and tore down the statuary and basically created the opportunity for Jehovah's Witnesses to exist.
There you go.
By basically like, no windows, prayer houses, bare, just done. It is expressly stated that the gospel offers no new law for secular government. Good. That's right. And that Christ did not command his apostles to change the civil order. There is no Christian order for society, for that would be an attempt to make sin disappear from the world. And that love would take the place of law. In other words, that created order will cease to exist in God's new creation in the new heavens.
Just everybody hold hands
New
and have their Coca-Cola.
By the way, this is essentially the subtext of every cult.
It is.
Yeah.
We're gonna love each other.
Yep.
And then it turns into law.
Always.
Yeah.
Yep. We're going to withdraw from society, whether it's in a city or whether we're going to move to another country, possibly where we've bought land, like, I don't know, in Guyana, like Jim Jones. But we're going to do this. We're going to move, the communists, right? The Russian communists who moved to Alaska.
What's the country that lives on the boat? SeaWorld or something?
Oh no, the Scientologist, L. Ron Hubbard, the Sea Org.
Oh, Sea Org. That's right. They have their boat.
Yeah, they have their boat. There's that only the special people get to go on the boat. Yeah.
I like the idea of having my own island and ruling myself until.
If you don't, I seriously question your ego. Like,
right.
If you've never at least once thought, you know what, I'd really like my own island.
Or at least like a really tall fence.
Both. Can I have both?
Can I electrify it?
The problem is I think my island would turn into the island of Dr. Moreau at a certain point.
Or
like, what's that over there? That's a man bear pig. I did that.
I decided to have fun.
My gift to you.
Or Jurassic Park, right? They just
right. Yeah.
We're just going to forget about that island in all the sequels.
Yeah. Just ignore the raptors. Ignore the raptors.
It didn't go well before. We'll try it again. Why not?
Yeah. I think, the Jurassic Park series is a great metaphor for socialism.
Yeah. Also, yeah. Because
it just every sequel gets worse. You can try a soft reboot. It doesn't make it better. You just increase the spectacle to distract from the fact that it's just the same script.
And it's on multiple levels because their attempts within the movie also are equally worse.
Right.
The movie itself is worse than the attempt. Right. Oh, good.
It's not Jurassic Park. It's Jurassic World.
See, we got it better this time. No, sorry.
No.
There's a reason why the dinosaurs are dead. It's for your benefit.
Exactly. That's why I do my part by eating chickens. Anyways, as the order of nature, one half of the created order will cease to exist in God's new creation, in the new heaven and the new earth, because there will be no more death. There will be no more night. So the secular order of law, the other half of the created order, will cease to exist at the last judgment, to which all legal order aims. That's a good point.
Yeah. So that's not only the government, it also is family, by the way, which I know offends people. And I kind of understand why. But on the other hand, I'm like, no, you're part of God's family.
Right.
So
that's your ultimate identity. We are caretakers of our children. We do not own them.
No.
Or possess them. They are not property. Even though our catechism actually says they kind of are. Ninth and 10th commandments.
But. Yeah. And your wife also.
Hey, I didn't say that.
Just quoting Luther. Just quoting Luther.
That's right. Don't shoot the messenger. Therefore, in the Augsburg Confession, the article on secular government is immediately followed by the article on the return of Christ to judgment, a correspondence which is elucidated by the 14th Schwabach article, quote, thus in the meantime, until the Lord comes for judgment and all power and rule cease to be, secular government and the rule are to be honored and obeyed as a station ordered by God to protect the godly and punish the evil. That last one. That last clause, when you exist in a post-Christendom world or a state in which your governing authority is actually anti-God, to protect the godly and punish the evil. Again, I don't care if you're a socialist or a communist or a Nazi or an anarchist or whatever. Your responsibility in your station, according to our confession, is to protect the godly and punish evil.
Yeah. But how are you going to?
The flip side of that would be the godly's responsibility then is to help direct you to what is truly evil versus what is truly good.
Yeah. And where we see it just like passively accepted, that is evil.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a, the thorn in the flesh that Paul talks about, right? Where it's just, it's worse than a minor annoyance. I mean, it's like, it's a burden that we all carry with us every day. That we know that there's gross evil being done around us. And, there's not much we can do to actually stop it because our authorities haven't. Well,
Yeah, no, 100%. And I talk about this in relation to the Psalms when we're in our Bible studies, is that at least according to the psalmist, what is considered evil is like not God.
right. Yeah.
God is good, and therefore what God does is good. Therefore, anything that is not of God is evil,
Mm-hmm.
categorically. In the civil realm, it's supposed to be a reflection of that, but it's not
Right.
because of sin. So then you have a godless state, for example, but you have godly people within that state.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If the people capitulate to the state, again, they're complicit in promoting sin. If they do not capitulate, we must be careful that we do not do so in hate
Right.
or with the intent of setting up a Christian state or saying, well, we're going to tear this man or woman down and we're going to prop up a good Christian man or woman as our new mayor, governor, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I appreciated the conversation with the Supreme Court hearing, particularly saying that, one of the defenses of the Constitution and its amendments, that's included, by the way, kids, the Constitution, the defense of it is it's imperfect.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated largely conservative people who defended the Constitution, saying, yes, it actually sets forth a higher standard than what we've attained as a country.
Yeah.
Because the standard that, as we said at the beginning of whatever episode it was, maybe an episode ago, the standard that the Constitution is relying upon is the standard established in God's word.
Correct.
And, of life, liberty, pursuit of property, personal property, personal autonomy, that kind of thing. That's established in God's word. We haven't attained it. And and where we have attained some modicum of it, it's imperfect. It's not complete.
Right.
We're always working towards that. We won't attain it this life. Right. But that shouldn't stop us from striving for it.
Right.
And that's the thing that's really fatiguing, is to say, well, we didn't get it done, so we should just abandon the whole thing and try something else that's
Or just rewrite it.
Or rewrite it in a way that's actually not helpful. That's distorting reality, also ultimately distorting the order of creation, the order.
We've talked about it before, is that when we look back at the Reformation, for example, our spiritual fathers, we look at them and say, oh, okay, they were way smarter than we are. So I'm not going to argue it. But then there's other people that you look at and you can say, you know what? I do disagree with this person. I don't think they're as thoughtful as those other people over there.
Right.
And so I am going to disagree with this. It's kind of the context of this whole show. But the point is that the myth of progress and the arrogance that comes with, where you're located at in time and space is, we can do this better. But only when you tear down the boundaries that have given you the freedom to have the conversation in the first place.
Yeah. So you end up being destructive rather than constructive.
Right. You think you're doing good by tearing it down and saying, well, we're going to build something up that's better. Are you, though? Have you
talks about
this through?
He talks about that in the second half of the document, which I'll link in the show notes. He talks about how, God does establish a governing authority out of anarchy, but the whole process of revolution and anarchy is not good. Right. I mean, we see that in the history of the world. We see it in the history of Israel. I mean, with the judges we talked about, they rebel, they tear down what God has established. But God does set up a new order out of it for their benefit. He's continually renewing that.
Right. But the damage to the people,
right? The number of deaths
is profound.
I mean, how many? 100 million in 20th century under desperate rulers?
plus million.
Yeah.
That we know of. That's documented.
Right. Exactly. I mean, that's incredible consequence for rebelling against, the created order.
Right. That's why when we talk about, death gods and worshiping death gods, that's what it means. Is that when the state sets itself up as a god and demands human sacrifice, because it does, because it has to enforce its
implicitly or passively. Yeah.
Right. Is the bodies will pile up. And at a certain point, you're going to have to acknowledge, where is everybody, and why are our cemeteries piled high with bodies?
Wait a minute. Why is Social Security bankrupt?
Right.
Oh, yeah. Where are the children?
Exactly.
That was the presumption.
At a certain point, if the church doesn't acknowledge that, then I think you're kind of missing the foundational argument here, which is when the state sets itself up as in place of God, that Caesar is God, how the state is God. The consequence is always death. Because that God is not a living God. It's a dead God. It's death. Well, and therefore, It has no life to give.
Yeah, and it will bring about the death of other institutions
It
along
will,
with
because
it.
we
Mhm.
foolishly demand that it give us our lives. Give me food, give me money, give me security, give me health, give me an education, give me, give me, give me, give me, give me.
Now
That's not
there's no more, free church hospitals.
right.
There's no more Christian adoption agencies.
Mm-hmm.
The food banks, the food co-ops that were free are no
Mm-hmm.
longer. Now
Yep.
now you have to show your social identity card or
Mm-hmm.
whatever to get in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So
Mm.
it's not this is a theological matter, and it is a matter of, like we've been talking about, are there orders? Are there stations? Is it God ordained? Is it good? And what is our relationship to the state and the civil authorities as Christians, as a church? And at least, and maybe for those of you listening, you have this conversation all the time. Where I'm at, it's not happening.
Mm-mm.
People have chosen sides, and that's that.
Well, and I think the most destructive aspect from the young people, and
Mm-hmm.
this is where I think we can see that we have failed to teach,
Mm-hmm.
is that there are some very strong cultural movements of destruction, of anarchy, of rejecting authority. And I mean, we grew up with some, with the man and whatever,
Sure.
but not, I don't think to the degree that we're seeing now.
No.
And maybe it's comparable, roughly comparable to the 60s, but I don't even know if that's true. We'll see over the next,
We will see.
months, years, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's the real consequence, is that a lot of people get hurt, a lot of property is
Mm-hmm.
destroyed, and people,
A lot
might
of people
lose their
die,
lives. Yeah, people lose
and
their
not
lives.
just from getting shot in the street.
No,
There's
no,
other means
all
to
to
deal with death.
all to remake,
The world in our
government
own image.
in the image that we want, whatever that image is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, rather than just go with what we've already been given,
Right.
and try to improve upon it.
Right. Because that's the base of any death cult, any religion that worships a death god, is we take what we are not given by God, and taking
Mhm.
requires violence.
To kill.
To kill, to harm, to basically, I've got a bigger stick and you're going to give this to me.
Mm.
Well,
Mm.
you're not giving it, you're taking it. God
Yeah.
didn't give it to you, which is why you're trying to take it.
Right.
That is the nature of sin, is to take what is not given in the way of gift. That's why the woman reaches in and takes the fruit. That's why the man takes it
Right.
from the woman. That's
Right.
why you see throughout history, what God has not given, we go out and take. That's why there are 10 commands, to protect us from ourselves and each other, because God gives me something that he doesn't give you. And then I start getting green-eyed, and I think to myself, you know what? I deserve that more than Chris does. So I'm
Mhm.
going to take it from him. And God's like, I didn't give it to you. It's like, well, I'm going to take it anyways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's where the violence breaks loose.
It does.
So on the other side of it, to end on a high note rather than a down note,
Yeah, do that.
this is why in the churches it is so literally vital that we preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, because that is the God of life, and the resurrection proves that. And the gifts of salvation are just that, gifts given to the church that save souls. They save us from guilt and shame. They save us from God's furious anger and judgment, so that whether it be locally, where we see God's judgment bust loose, or in relation to the church, the gospel is not being preached because churches are closed. The gifts are not being administered because we've turned our backs to God's word, whatever. The purpose of Jesus's resurrection, the power of that resurrection, is we can stand up and say, no, we are going to preach the gospel. We are
Right.
going to administer the gifts. That's what we're called to do. And that supersedes any authority, ultimately.
Well,
And we
because
don't do it.
it's
It's not
it's the
yeah.
only message that persists into eternity.
Correct, because it's the only true message of love that we've ever been given.
Mm-hmm.
In all of human history, it's the only true message of love that God says, here's where you can come and know me perfectly.
Yeah, complete self-sacrificial love.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if we take that away, then there is nowhere else in the world that you can go to receive that. There are no, like we talked about with God and freedom, there's nowhere where you're going to receive true freedom outside of the gospel and the gifts, or relief from the law outside of the gospel and the gifts, or when God holds that mirror of the law up to you and Jesus steps in the way and says, look at me. Look at me instead. Don't look at yourself. Look at me. That's the nature of gift. That's the nature of the gospel. And ultimately, too, as Christians in every generation have hoped in and been confident in this truth, even if they shut down our churches. We just sang this hymn yesterday, right? Even when, the church is on
we
foundation.
did too. We did too.
Is that even if they shut down our churches, the gospel will still get out and be preached. Even if they kill our preachers, the gospel will still get preached. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Again, there were death cults, wall-to-wall death cults in Israel. And the Israelites participated in them. And yet, here we are, preaching the gospel, administering the sacraments.
Right. Oh. Well, and as things do crumble and decay around us, potentially, it is the gospel that's the only remedy, really.
Yeah.
For us, for our community, for our families.
Right. So cling to the gospel. It's like Frodo in Shalob's lair with the light, with the elven light and the sword, is that the gospel is the light in the darkness. So preach the gospel.
Yeah, and then you can see what's in the dark.
And then you can see what's in the dark, because the darkness cannot comprehend the light. So
it hurts. It hurts.
We'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening to these 2 episodes, and we'll be back, God willing, and the creek don't rise, with some brand new episodes.
Yeah, someday,
somewhere,
whatever time it is. We should stop making time references in the episodes so that they could come out whenever.
Yeah, that's true. I like that. It's all my fault. All right, brothers and sisters, thank you as always, and we will talk to you again soon. Peace.